You want to be happy? I want to be happy. But it's not just about me. We live as a society, an us. So how do we conceive of or think of happiness in the context of an us? And is our government helpful in that regard? Are the powers that be maybe reluctant to help us on our individual journey towards happiness? Well, let's talk about that. John Stuart Mill on what is happiness and the good life. In previous videos, we've talked about what it means to be a good person, what is right, what is wrong, whether it's Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and so on. But let's just step back for a second and think large scale. When we talk about morality, what is it that we're pointing to? What is it specifically that we're thinking about? And what is the challenge of thinking about morality? And I promise you it's a unique challenge, one of the most important, in fact. My argument, and the argument for many of those that we've been discussing, is that you and I are moral creatures. We live with other people, and so we have to figure out how our relationships can be right versus, poor, bad, or just plain wrong. It's not really a question of whether or not we're moral creatures. It's how good are we at thinking about being moral and acting. So there's thinking, the theory, of course, and there's the application or the practice of being a moral person. And it's difficult sometimes to know the difference between just living a life as you've been told by your society, your customs, your norms, your parents, authority figures, governments. This is how you should act. And that's quite a bit different than reflecting on, thinking about, and then deciding how you want to live based on your reflections and conscience, however that might lead you. So we have laws in culture that may want to get in the way of telling us this is what we think is right or wrong. So we have laws that may tell us, no, this is really how you're going to act anyway. We have other peer pressure, pop culture, going one direction, whereas you may want to go another. Religion, politics, just overall, the world we live in is pulling us in different directions. Do you have a sense of those directions? Do you have a sense of the moral obligations, the norms, to use a fancy term, the norms of your culture? And if you do, that's wonderful. That's very hard to arrive at through reflection, think about to actually identify the strings like a puppet that they're trying to pull at you to get you to act, believe, think a certain way. But also, are you able to question those? It's one thing to identify them. It's quite another to challenge them meaningfully and find a new direction. John Stuart Mill is going to be discussing, how do you and I live happy? We want to be happy, but how do we live in a way that reflects a good conscience, a way that reflects a good education, a way that reflects the autonomy of the individual. So we don't want a whole bunch of parents telling us what to do all the time, whether it's parents in terms of government or literal parents. So happiness for John Stuart Mill is going to mean a specific thing under the banner of utilitarianism. So we'll see what you think about that. Many of us just act. So our moral theory is whatever is popular at that particular time in that particular culture, it's whatever works for us in the moment. There's a certain sense of a loss of self-ownership, however, when we're not aware of why we do or how we do or the meaning of what we do. There's a sense in which if we're just going by instinct or drives, we're not so much our own as we are a product of a culture or a product of an institution. So thinking about morality has enormous practical value. If for no other reason, then it simply makes your life more your own. If we take for granted that we all have to make moral decisions, that we all act morally because we live with other people, then having a power over that to make a discernment, a choice, is person building, selfhood building, and that's very exciting. Is there an exact way to do this? Maybe not. And as we'll see with Mill, he has a specific way of thinking in which he says that basically, as long as you're making a choice and you're not forced and you have a minimum amount of common sense and life experience, then that moral choice is probably the best. Not because it literally yields the best consequences, but because it's yours. And that is the best consequence, that it's your decision making versus somebody else making it up for you. All right. So what is a moral theory? A moral theory is a way we explain right from wrong in theory and in practice. And there are three big forms that we've seen already in previous videos. Teleology is a big one with Aristotle. Whatever ethics is, it's about a purpose-driven life. Purpose in terms of how trees work, how humans work, how fish work, how the universe works. We follow the imprinted DNA, the form, the essence, whatever that might mean in each of us. And when we realize the best version of ourselves, we're realizing our purpose. That's moral. Now, if I'm sitting on the couch every day and I'm not realizing the best version of me, that's immoral. I'm breaking nature somehow. I'm breaking my DNA, not literally my DNA, my essence, the thing inside of me that wants to be, that wants to arrive when I become smarter, more compassionate, and so on. I'm breaking all of those things. Laziness, in other words, or maybe cowardice, in other words, are immoral because they stop teleology, they stop my purpose. Deontology, we haven't done a video, or I haven't done a video on Kant yet, but he's an important figure. He's an example of someone who argues that you and I ought to obey reason, that we're obligated to obey reason. The rightness of an action has something to do with intrinsic value, not consequences, maybe purpose in a way, but not really purpose. He's thinking about deontology as finding the rules, most rational course of action, the rational rules for the human being. We might also think about something like the Ten Commandments as an example of universal rules that people are expected to follow. So deontology says, what's moral? Your duty to God, maybe. Your duty to reason, maybe. Your duty to family, to country, maybe. All of these things. There's something about devoting yourselves to this and following a path of reason that is moral. So what is immoral? Being irrational, not encouraging the best part of what it means to be human. Maybe saying no to God or duty to God would be irrational. It would be, immoral. The third one is consequentialism. And under consequentialism, we find utilitarianism, which is what we're going to be discussing today. So consequentialism says basically this: as it sounds, what makes something moral? The consequences, what the result is. So not some hidden purpose necessarily about, human flourishing, which sounds wonderful, but for many consequentialists is something you can't measure. You simply can't measure it. So how would you know if you're achieving your purpose? And it's not necessarily being rational and finding rules that make us better, rules of logic, rules from God, maybe. Deontology, how do you measure that too, is a concern. But for consequentialists and utilitarians, as we're going to discuss Bentham in a moment, they think they can measure the results. They think they can measure the success of their moral views. Maximize the best, which is typically conceived of as pleasure or happiness, for the most number of people, that's what's moral. What's immoral? Pain, suffering, destruction. All these things kind of roll in on top of one another. What's good? Pleasure. Now, we don't know what pleasure is. There are many ways of thinking about this, but we're going to try and narrow it down in just a moment. The take-home message there is whether you're into purpose, teleology, or deontology, is a study of belief and duty, or consequentialism, and we're going to use the word utilitarianism. Depending on which one you're interested in the most, these represent pretty distinct doors. You're not going through two of these at the same time. You can overlap these, the nuances of these. It's complicated, but basically you're going to choose one over the others, primarily. And for Mill, as with Bentham and other famous utilitarians, what counts is what you can really measure at the end of the day, what you can see tangibly in terms of the results, the consequences. This is going to be problematic. We'll see what you think. John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, English-born philosopher, British philosopher, had a nervous breakdown in his 20s. And the story goes that because of his father, largely, he was quite demanding, but because of his father, Mill had this nervous breakdown. Now you have to imagine, a nervous breakdown takes many forms, of course. I've never had one. I've been very, very stressed out and very anxious, doing a PhD or something like that, I remember going for my PhD defense and just being terrified what was going to happen. Years and years of work, and they might say no. It has happened before. People have gone for PhD defense and they don't get it. Anyway, just this incredible anxiety. But Mill broke, and this served a number of very important thinking points or talking points for his philosophy. If we can imagine a nervous breakdown as simply just being unable to cope, that's it. You're overwhelmed with the demands. You can picture his father kind of pointing at him, do this, do this, do this, or think that way, or do this the way I want you to. And at one point you just kind of throw your hands up and go, I can't deal with all these things. The demands are bigger than my abilities. Or maybe I just shouldn't be dealing with these things. This experience convinced Mill of two things. First, individual happiness is so important. Individual happiness. Now, when he's talking about individual happiness, but he's also talking about social happiness. But, okay, so the importance is definitely individual happiness, but it won't make sense outside of society. And the second thing is he's convinced in the role or the purpose of a good education. I like to lump in the idea of education and experience, life experience, because it can be a formal education where you go to school, you read books, and that's important, obviously, for Mill. But also life experiences that teach you through making mistakes, traveling the world and realizing that there are alternative worldviews and different ways to think. I remember one of the first few times that I traveled outside of my continent, it's really quite jarring how the customs that I take for granted are just entirely different. I remember my wife and I this was years ago, we were standing in line. We think we were going on a cruise ship, and some people just came and they stood right in front of us. And I couldn't wrap my head around why that was a relatively common practice in that culture. That, for me, life experience, education. So what do we have? The importance of being happy and the importance of life experience and education. Huge for Mill. Major recurring themes for Mill include these. The first one is tyranny of the majority. I love the phrase tyranny of the majority. Mill is concerned that societies encourage conformity. The louder the social voice, and every society is of course loud, pop culture, peer pressure, whatever the dominant norm is, with ethics, politics, religion, those voices are very loud, constantly telling us to do something. And I don't know if there's any culture anywhere that's truly neutral. Right? What would that even look like? So there's always a threat in every culture that conformity is a primary value, and they want us to behave and to think in a certain way, regardless of where you are. The most liberal, we see this sort of counter-liberal movement in North America especially, where even the most liberal voice that says, think what you want, do what you want, still has very strong values regarding what thinking should be and what speaking should be. And we're going to see this a little bit with Mill as well, whereas he pushes for a very open-ended liberal perspective. At the end of the day, there are a fair number of control factors in here. We're just not free to do whatever we want, whenever we want. Okay, but I digress. The argument here is that society encourages conformity. The will of the people is something that threatens us. The will of the government, the majority, is something that threatens us. And by us, I mean even the people who are part of the majority. They're constantly being threatened in their freedom and therefore in their happiness. When picture a stream, right? The fish are going this way down the stream, and the fish kind of don't realize it, but they're not very happy. They should be going the other way. And one fish tries to turn around and go the other way to be happy. That's a weird analogy, I know. It's just incredibly difficult to do that. When everybody's going this direction, and that one fish wants to find happiness, and he's not swimming against people and hurting people. He's just going a different direction upstream, not harming anybody. Very, very difficult. So my question to you, is a tyranny of the majority something that threatens your happiness today? Think of peer pressure in school, right? Did you dress the right way or wrong way? Did you have the right hairstyle? Or, you get the idea. Do you drive the wrong car, the wrong skin color, and so on? So yes, in every culture and every time, a tyranny of the majority. This has a lot to do with his concern over government, because government has a very loud voice too in terms of the control of laws, control of policies. The imagination there. So how do we think about liberal civil society? What is the best form or shape? A lot of the questions then regarding my personal happiness immediately reflect the persons, the powers, the majority around me, and how they're being run, how they're being legalized and executed. Not literally executed, enacted. Executed, that's a different conversation. Mill points out that individual autonomy is against the instincts of society. Just like that fish that wants to turn around in that stream and go the other direction, his argument is that society at heart is opposed to that. And if that's true, and if individual happiness, as he believes after his nervous breakdown, is so important, then society is very much at odds to your happiness. Think about that for a second. So part of this is Mill has to decide, what does he mean by civil liberty? And it has something to do with discerning or coming to grips with how much power the state or the government is allowed to have. And that's a delicate balance. And we see this throughout cultures, even today, people debating, the government has too much power. The government doesn't have enough power. The government should do this to help those people, but to do that, it needs more power. It needs more authority, which it doesn't have. So should we give government more authority so that it can have more control over people's lives with the hope that they have good intent to bring more happiness? Or do we want government to be more hands-off with the hope that people themselves can figure it out? You've seen this dance, no doubt, playing out. Even whatever is in the news headlines right now probably has something to do with this idea of civil liberty. So we need individual freedom in whatever culture, the ideal utilitarian culture. We need individual freedom because it leads to individual happiness. It also leads, according to Mill, to the production of geniuses, truly original, creative thinkers that think outside the box. We don't want everybody swimming the same way down the same stream. Complex problems, whether it's the environment or politics, whatever, it's very hard to solve those when everybody's thinking one way. We want people thinking originally. We want unique individuals as much as society will allow. So this is one of the criteria for happiness. How much does your society encourage uniqueness? And again, remember from Mill, societies are not by nature interested in uniqueness. They're interested in conformity. Perhaps one of Mill's most famous contributions is this. So long as one's actions do not harm another person, you should be allowed to do whatever you want to do. Let me say that again. As long as you're not hurting or harming anybody else at all, you should be able to do whatever you want to yourself in your own sphere of existence. In other words, society is not your boss or parent. It's not responsible for protecting you from you. You want to go and jump off a cliff? I highly recommend you don't. But if you want to do that, society should not be in a position to say, no, you shouldn't do that. Now, that's a silly example. But let's say you want to be a philosopher. Well, you're not going to make much money being a philosopher. So society might tell you, hey, listen, if you want to have a nice home and a nice car, that kind of thing, maybe you should do something. Do what you want to do. And as long as you're not harming anybody else, you should be allowed to do it. As wonderful as that is, the immediate problem is, how do we know what constitutes harm? How do we know what harm is? Is it just anything negative? Is it something that we find distasteful? Remember, Mill is fighting for individual autonomy, the freedom to think and be original. And that fish that swims the other way up the stream, one might argue they're causing harm because they're destabilizing the flow of fish going the other direction. They're doing things that are counterintuitive. So being original, being unique, being individual, I don't know. Maybe that might be for some harm. Obviously not for Mill, but for some. Saying everybody should be allowed to do whatever they want with themselves in their own lives as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else sounds wonderful, but it is also a bit too open-ended. And Mill argues, and this is kind of where the freedom has limits, children and people from immature races should not be allowed the same kind of freedom as the more rational, the more educated, the more experienced countries, persons, or individuals. Why? Well, he believes that we ought to be helping those realize their freedom, and realizing their freedom and their individuality requires, again, that education or that life experience, something that children don't have, something that immature, we might imagine barbaric cultures that treat women poorly, these are inherently dysfunctional and dangerous because obviously they're hurting women. They're not treating women equals with men and so on. So in those cases, Mill argues that they shouldn't have the same kind of freedom and that we're obligated to help them. So children, immature cultures, those who can't exercise their rational faculties or even their common sense, he's just put a few criteria on that make it really difficult and risky, because he's opening the door not just to government, but to any self-proclaimed expert that seems to say, I know how life works, I know how ethics is, I'm a philosopher, listen to me, to being another possible case of the tyranny of the majority. We could also frame this, however, that Mill is just setting up a minimum, that you can be free, you can be an individual, you can be happy if you meet this minimum criteria, right? This basic stuff. And unfortunately, children don't meet it, and really immature, messy cultures that don't treat each other well, they don't meet that minimum requirement either. So until they meet the minimum, whatever that might be, they're probably not going to be happy, and they're certainly not going to have the kind of freedom they need to be truly, fully happy. We might rephrase this as, we're all obligated to guide and protect. We're obligated to guide and protect. Protect other people from harm, protect other people from me harming them, of course, but other people. If I know of somebody who's going around hurting others, maybe they're lying profusely to get financial gain, manipulation techniques. Maybe it's an advertiser on TV, or maybe it's a company that's using sweatshop labor, right, to make something. We're obligated, whether that's our country or not, we're obligated to speak up and to point out that these people are not being protected. Because their individual liberty or freedom is not being protected, they can't be happy. And remember, we want people to be happy. And so society at large is responsible for this minimum criteria of helping us get a healthy start. It doesn't guarantee our happiness, but at least it's a start. Happiness belongs to reasonable, rational adults who follow their passions without being controlled by the tyranny of the majority. Let me say it again. Happiness belongs to rational, reasonable individuals or adults able to follow their passions without being under the strict control of the world around them. A helpful contrast with Mill is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham predates Mill in his thinking, and Mill adds to Bentham. He's not entirely happy with what Bentham has to say, but they remain in that utilitarian group, and morality is consequences. For Bentham, the consequences of morality, the best moral theory and practice, is one that brings about happiness and causes the least amount of pain. So here's the famous phrase: the greatest good for the greatest number. The greatest good for the greatest number. How does he define that? What does it mean to have the greatest good? It's not clear. It's not clear with Bentham, it's not clear with Mill, and while these theorists like to argue that there's something more measurable about their moral views than the contrary or the opposing views, it's not always clear what they mean by harm, and it's not always clear what they mean by happiness. But Bentham gets pretty close, I think. He believes that you and I are inherently selfish and in the pursuit of pleasure. So what is the greatest good? The greatest pleasure. Not the greatest, physical prowess or the greatest intellect. Pleasure in the most basic, raw sense. When you're eating a turkey dinner, it's wonderful if you like turkey. It tastes good. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. These are terrible, right? You don't want sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And Bentham is just saying, yeah, you do. You're an animal. You're inherently selfish. You're in the constant pursuit of pleasure. To deny that would be immoral. It would be counterintuitive. You are a pleasure-seeking animal. Not all pleasures are equal, but maybe we can figure out the best way to achieve the most. The greatest good for the greatest number, the most amount of pleasure possible. Pleasure is the only component of happiness, and pain is the only component of unhappiness. Notice we've gone from, in previous videos, thinking about Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, this idea of beauty and happiness as contemplation, as this lofty, elevated sense of the human, to a very basic, my dog runs around eating anything that looks like it might be tasteful, like anything at all. He brought me a mouse the other day. It was dead, and I had to basically wrestle him to the ground. He's 70 pounds now. I had to wrestle him to the ground to get this dead mouse. Highly unpleasurable for me, but very pleasurable for him. So, are we all kind of like animals running around looking for dead mice? Well, kind of in a way. It might look different for you than for me, but this is animalistic, raw pursuit of pleasure. But we're not just like animals. We can actually calculate and be schemy and be smart about getting the most amount of pleasure. This is a brilliant part of Bentham. There are 7 questions here. I'm just going to read them. When you get up in the morning, Do you question how I can get the most amount of pleasure? You probably do, but how many questions do you have to secure the most amount of pleasure? How many questions do you have to guide you in the best practice, the most amount of good, the most amount of pleasure for the most number of people? Here are some questions. How strong is the pleasure? So again, that metric of figure out, trying to measure how strong is the pleasure. How long will it last? Okay. How likely or unlikely is it that the pleasure will occur? Because if you're gambling on a turkey dinner, but it's very unlikely that it's going to happen, well, that's not a smart way to live. How soon will the pleasure occur? Well, if I was hoping in the next 20 years for a turkey dinner, not so great. But in the next day or two, well, that's different. The probability that the action will be followed by sensations of the same kind. So if you eat too much turkey, you may find yourself not wanting to eat turkey again for months and months because you kind of ruined it as an experience. So what, in your head, what are the chances that it'll be followed by positive feelings? So followed on that, the probability, what is the probability that it'll be followed by sensations of pain? And finally, how many people will be affected by this? This is interesting. Utilitarianism, hedonism in general, is often accused of being a very selfish thing. And it is. But in this sense, as we'll see with Mill as well, there is some argument here that society benefits by thinking about individual happiness. That these are connected. They're not extremes, one over the other, one or dichotomy, but they're connected in a meaningful way. And we see this initially with Bentham. No doubt you can guess there are going to be problems with this sort of raw animalistic version of pleasure seeking. Does that mean that all pleasures are equal? That my dog's dead mouse is just like my turkey dinner? Well, he has a dead mouse, I have a dead bird. Are they really that different? This is where Mill starts to become a bit uneasy with Bentham. The idea that all pleasures are equal really make a number of philosophers upset. People like Kant, Hegel, even Nietzsche don't like this idea. They think this idea that utility as the pursuit of raw pleasure is too animalistic, and humans aren't like that. Well, you could use the word vulgar. It's distasteful. Morality, for these other philosophers, has a higher calling. It requires more than just seeking out your base desires, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now, sex, drugs, and rock and roll might not be bad, depending on the drugs. Definitely rock and roll is always bad. Don't start with rock and roll. Big trouble. These things in moderation are fine. There's nothing inherently bad about pleasure. But the argument is, if that's it, if that's what we as a species want to achieve, then they're arguing, no, we're missing out. And this is where Mill is taking off from Bentham. Bentham is aiming too low. Still, he's doing something very helpful here, trying to make sense of what do we mean by happiness? How might we achieve more of it? He's getting pretty calculated, and we might call Bentham's a quantitative, not qualitative, quantitative. He's putting numbers on happiness. It's a slippery slope now between calculating people and their happiness and calculating people as a means to my happiness and calculating people as objects to social happiness. It's a slippery slope from, okay, let's add up how much turkey dinner gives me. Let's say on a scale of 10, it gives me 4 out of 10 pleasure. Wonderful. But let's say turkeys are pretty rare in my culture, and I might have a little bit more money than the average person. So I have a turkey dinner every week, and the average person only gets one once a year. But that's okay, because we're all still kind of happy in a way, but my calculation for happiness is a bit higher. So this raises problems not only of how do we count happiness, make it quantitative, as Bentham is trying to do, but also how we share happiness, how we distribute happiness. Should happiness be equal? Not just in terms of the rat versus the mouse rather versus the turkey, but in who gets to have their share of it, their piece of it. And again, just to repeat myself, one of the things that's so frustrating about Bentham's perspective is that it takes this cost-benefit analysis over all of life as the template for morality. What is moral? Well, the cost-benefit analysis that will be able to get the most amount of happiness. And that's it, in terms of physical pleasure. Not happiness in terms of necessarily contemplation, unless somehow that gives you physical pleasure. And this leads invariably to the distribution problem of happiness. As you know, finances in North America, around the world, are incredibly unequally distributed, billionaires and trillionaires, while people are still hungry. So if we are thinking about pleasure in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, maybe it's pretty easy to map that onto, well, how has money been shared? How has money been distributed? Because again, maybe the argument is we're not all equally deserving of happiness, that some people deserve more happiness. That's not the greatest good for the greatest number. That's not what Bentham or Mill are going to argue, but that is what some people believe, and that it is how some people act. Would we then call it immoral? I deserve more happiness than you? And if we do, what does that say about capitalism in terms of they deserve more money than I do? Mill's response is to say, okay, yes, utilitarianism is still the way to go, but instead of quantity, this cost-benefit analysis, we also need to think about the quality, the actual the makeup of the pleasure itself. And maybe, just maybe, some of them are lesser. Some of them are not as good as. So, okay, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, okay. Turkey and mice, okay. But maybe someone like Aristotle, who liked to contemplate the universe and to think, maybe there's room to say that those philosophers, maybe there's something there too. Maybe it's not just that they're all equal. Maybe there's something in thinking outside of just pure hedonistic pleasure. How do we know? How do we know this? Mill's response is, well, because informed judges and people with life experience, smart people, they have wisdom, they tell us that there's more to life than these basic hedonistic pleasures. Think of a child growing up, you get into your teen years, you're trying to find your place in the world, your parents are always trying to tell you what to do, and at one point you just stop listening to them. Mill's argument is that as much as we want you as an individual to be an individual and you unique, making your own decisions, they have some wisdom. They've made mistakes too. They're a source of education for you. Consider that in your evaluation of what real happiness is. Don't just dismiss their versions of happiness, even though we do want you to be unique in your own pursuit of happiness. Quote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Okay. Wow. The argument here is that you have a pig wallowing in the mud, and then you have Socrates as great philosophical thinker. Are these two things equal? The pig loves the mud. My dog loves mice and the mud. The dog loves the mud. I'm not a big fan of those things myself. There's nothing inherently wrong with the mud, but Mill's argument is there's something better. The pig can't know the philosophical contemplation that Socrates and you can. The pig can only know the mud. And if you want to play in the mud like my children do, actually, hey, have at it. But realize that when you're in your 30s and 40s and 50s, if your highest ambition in life is to play in the mud, you might be missing out. So his argument is simple. Yes, happiness comes in all forms, including rolling in the mud like the pigs, but it's better to achieve more. It's better to experience more. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied. So not satisfied. Socrates was never satisfied that he had the answer. He always wanted more, but he was dissatisfied. That's still better than the fool who's satisfied. The person who says, hey, I have all the answers. I know everything there is to life. So he's setting up this hierarchy that there's good, better, and best. And that it's more moral for quality of happiness, not just volume, not just quantity. Because the fact of the matter is there's a lot of mud in the world. And let's say that all gives us a 1 out of 10 on the happiness scale, playing in the mud. It's much harder to have that philosophical reflection, thought, to know who I am, to develop a belief system that reflects my convictions about life. It's much harder to do that. But even that, even if you don't fully achieve it, is better than just a pig rolling in the mud. All right, we've come a long way. What do we know so far? Well, we have a number of theories, teleology, deontology, and consequentialism, that are kind of saying the human being is best realized by going through one of these doors. We have a sense that happiness is at the cornerstone of what it means to be a human, this moral theory that you need to be happy. To be happy, you need a certain sense of human freedom, individuality. That immediately challenges our cultures, the powers that be, the governments, our parents, everything. But for Mill, we can ground ourselves by developing life experiences and education, and of course, in our pursuit of happiness. We don't want to fall into a trap of just saying any pleasure is equal, because we may find ourselves living like a pig in the mud. Just pure sex, drugs, and rock and roll all the time without anything else leaves us missing out. There's more to life than that. Okay, so what do? If we agree that we know the most amount of happiness for the most number of people, and we agree that there are good, better, and best forms of happiness, well then, how do we distribute it? How do we get people sort of equally engaged with this? For Mill, if we don't have a sense of justice, it's not clear what he means by justice, and it's not clear what he means by harm. It's frustrating, I know. But without this sense of justice, without this sense of fairness, then whatever we do as a moral theory in terms of happiness is going to be screwed. It's going to be really messy. It could even be dangerous and corruptive. I'm going to argue that maybe that's part of what's going on with capitalism. Right? The corruption of capitalism is that only a select few really get the opportunities, and the rest of us is sort of the workhorse of society. We don't have access to the same kinds of life experiences. I digress. So now we have the quantity, and we have to think about the quality of happiness. So you want to be happy. You want a better world. Based on Mill, we need a good education. We need life experience. All right. We need to have a sense of individual freedom to make our own decisions. Okay. We need to encourage people to have a good conscience, whatever that might mean, in terms of justice. We have a sense of other people. We are aware of other people. We're aware that other people need to be happy, and we're interested in their happiness as well. It's not just about me. I cannot have a good conscience if the whole world revolves around me. I ought to feel bad. But at the same time, I'm very much interested in realizing my individual, whatever, uniqueness, freedom, happiness. Why talk about freedom? Why talk about individual choice? Each of us should have the freedom of pursuing our own good in our own way. Let me read another quote. If a person possesses any tolerable amount of common sense and experience, any common sense or experience, his own or her own mode of laying out his existence is the best. Not because it is the best in itself, but because it is his own mode. End quote. What is Mill saying? We want to be happy. We're sorting through both qualitative and quantitative views of happiness. It's not clear what that means. We're trying to distribute it fairly. We're pushing to have a good conscience. We don't know what harm really is. We're not really sure what good conscience is. He's not clear on these things. But he's saying, listen, at the end of the day, the main criteria for how well you're living your life is that you are living your life. You are making those decisions. Are you going to make mistakes? Yes. Are you going to make decisions that actually cause pain? That's okay. It's not that you are making the best decisions to get the most amount of happiness. It's that you're making the decisions trying to be happy and trying to get happiness for other people. This is interesting. Whereas Bentham is saying, avoid pain, achieve pleasure, physical pleasure, and that's moral. Bentham is saying, hey, you know what? You may actually experience some difficulties in life, and it's going to be dissatisfying often, but that it's your decision-making in your life, that you've been given the freedom to be you. That's happiness. That's the pursuit of happiness in one of its best forms. To pursue your good in your own way. Not to say that all goods are relative, because remember, he has said that some are better than others. You need to figure that out on your own. That's the highest good. Mill's discussion of happiness, the pursuit of happiness in society, is clearly quite relevant today as it was yesterday, and it will be tomorrow. But one of the unique things that he says, others have talked about this, but one of the unique points that he tries to drive home is the indispensable nature, the need for free society to speak. Specifically the press, the media. Everyone should be allowed to speak for Mill. It doesn't matter who you are, as long as your speech isn't really hurting somebody. If your speech is somehow hurting people, not just hurting their feelings and not just making them feel, oh, you're saying something that makes me uncomfortable, but genuinely hurting people, like rallying groups of rioters to go hurt people, something like that. For the most part, people should be allowed to speak however they want. Now imagine, if you will, the worst politicians of all time, whether it's Stalin, Pol Pot, Hitler, you name it. We get one of them in a time machine and we bring them to the present. And We go to a major news broadcaster and we allow this person to be interviewed. Is that a good thing? Well, for many people, having Hitler interviewed on Fox or CNN or whatever, BBC, just seems absurd. We shouldn't allow people like that to talk. Everything they say leads to death and disease, trouble, bad things. So what do we do with that? Mill's argument is that if we censor truth, then there's a good chance we may never realize it. If we censor people we don't like, we may be censoring truth. So we don't want to censor truth. That seems like an obvious thing. We don't want to censor truth. But that takes a God's eye view to know truth from falsity. And often when we think we're encouraging truth, we actually may be encouraging lies, mistruths. So we don't want to censor truth, but do we also want to censor false truth, claims, propaganda, lies? His answer is no, we don't want to censor falsity either, because if we say no to things we know to be true, which may actually turn out to be right. I mean, hindsight, how many global leaders have said, so for instance, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, turned out there were no weapons of mass destruction, so hindsight. But if we censor what we think is false now, we won't have the experience of overcoming it. We won't have the experience of sorting truth from error. Does that make sense? We don't want to censor truth, but we don't often know what truth is, and the tyranny of the majority of voices may be saying this is true and it's not. Okay, fine. We certainly don't want to censor people who have unique voices, marginalized groups. We want to bring them in as much as we can, but we don't want to censor things that we know to be false either. So many things, we know the claims for COVID on so many broadcasting stations right now are clearly false regarding the science. They don't seem to understand the science. They don't seem to understand that the vaccine is working for COVID, and they still keep the vaccine hesitancy, and the message is still there. So should we censor them? Should we take them off Twitter or Facebook? And Mill says no, because if we take them off, if we pre-digest the truth for others, then others will never have the experience of dealing with lies. They'll never have the experience of dealing with falsehood, and they won't realize individual freedom from those things, for having thought through them, wrestled with them, to be happy. This is a very interesting view. Mill seems less interested in truth. And we're not, as a philosopher, I want the truth, this is the truth. And he's more interested in people grappling with truth and lies, grappling with life experiences that may bring displeasure, pain, and all under the rubric of utilitarianism as a catalyst for something better. On the surface, Mill almost seems naive. Will the light of truth prevail? Slowly. So slow, it seems. Societies are so slow to come to realize that the Earth is not the center of the galaxy, right? So slow to realize that women are equal to men. So slow to realize climate change. We're just so slow as a society. But Mill is not, look, it's not your responsibility to have the truth and share it with everyone. Your responsibility is to live your life as best you can with a good conscience, seeking a fair distribution of happiness for everyone around you, so to be mindful of other people, all the while realizing that there are powers that want to rob you of those opportunities. But to be happy, we need to challenge them.